Okay, thank you everyone for being here. I'm going to just briefly introduce our speaker for today, Al Roth, who's the Craig and Susan McCaw Professor of Economics at Stanford, and the Gunn Professor of Economics and Business Administration Emeritus at Harvard. He works in the areas of game theory, experimental economics, and market design, and shared the 2012 Nobel Memorial Prize in Economics, I believe with Lloyd Shapley, who recently passed away. Forbes has sometimes referred to Al as representing unfreakonomics because in contrast to, for example, the authors of books like Freakonomics, who, according to Forbes, are fascinated by obscure but intriguing questions like how to detect cheating by sumo wrestlers, Roth relishes real-world challenges. Those real-world challenges include designing the medical residency matching program, the Boston and New York school choice systems, and the kidney matching algorithms used in kidney exchange programs. And Al is here with us today to discuss his work and his new book, Who Gets What and Why. I'm going to hold it up, but now I've left it. Here it is, also available in an Audible version. So please welcome Al Roth.
Is this microphone live? Can you hear me? No. All right, I better. Okay, I'll try to be here then. Can you hear me now? So, delighted to be here. Thank you, Kim. I want to talk to you today about markets and maybe expand your idea of what markets are. As Kim mentioned, I just wrote a book. It came out in June, and one of the nice things about this time of year for having written a book is this is the time when the translations start to come out, and that's sort of fun because markets and languages have a lot in common. They're both ancient human artifacts. They're things that people make. And just like there are many natural languages, just as there are many languages, there are lots of different kinds of markets and marketplaces. And I think that when most people think about markets, we tend to think about commodity markets. And I'm going to talk today mostly about markets that are not commodity markets. But let's think for a moment about commodity markets and what makes them so interesting and simple and iconic. When you're buying shares of a company on the New York Stock Exchange, you don't care who you're dealing with. You don't worry about whether they've taken good care of those shares while they had them, and they don't worry about whether you're going to take good care of those shares. Only the price matters. The job of the New York Stock Exchange is price discovery, to discover the prices at which supply equals demand at every moment during the day for each of the financial commodities that are being sold. But not all markets work that way. In lots of markets, you care who you're dealing with, and prices may be important, but they don't do all the work. And in some of the markets I'll tell you about, like kidney exchange and school choice, we don't really let prices do any of the work. So think about college admissions. Duke doesn't fill its entering class by raising tuition until supply equals demand, and just enough students would like to study at Duke to fill the classes. It's expensive to go to Duke, but it's cheap enough that lots of people would like to study here. And so the market has other market clearing institutions. There are application processes, there are essays and interviews and admissions, and you can't come to Duke unless you've been admitted. And matching markets in general are markets that are like that, markets where you can't simply choose what you want, even if you can afford it, but you also have to be chosen. So college admission, you have to be admitted. In labor markets, you can't just show up and work at Google, you have to be hired. And similarly, Google can't just decide that you'll come to work at Google. They have to compete with Facebook and Airbnb. So these are matching markets, and some of the most important markets in our lives are matching markets, where we go to school, what jobs we get, who we marry, and college admissions and labor markets have something in common with marriage. You can't just choose your spouse. You also have to be chosen. So the matching markets that we engage in have to have other institutions that let us identify not just prices, but individuals with whom we want to transact. So let's think a little bit about what marketplaces have to do in general. And often, the field that I work in has come to be called market design. A better name might be marketplace design, right? Because marketplaces are the places where markets happen, and that's where rules are applied and things like that. But marketplaces have to perform a number of tasks in order to help a market work successfully. And let me tell you what I think are quite general tasks that marketplaces have to do, but use Airbnb as my example so that we can make it concrete. So the first thing a marketplace has to do is it has to help the market become thick. It has to bring together a lot of people who want to transact with each other so that it becomes a good place to look for transactions. So Airbnb started as a website in San Francisco, and one of the ways they got thickness is they started buying up their competitors. For instance, CrashPatter was a very similar website in England, and by buying CrashPatter, Airbnb began to be able to offer places to stay in San Francisco to travelers who originated in England, and offer places to stay in England to travelers who originated in San Francisco, and that made the market thicker on both sides. They had more travelers and more hosts. Now, one of the as Airbnb became successful, they created a thick market, and their competitors stopped being other websites, but started to be giant hotel companies like Hilton Hotels. And one of the problems that come with thickness is you have to deal with congestion, right? So when the market is thick, when there are lots of us in the marketplace looking to transact with each other, it might be hard for us to find each other just because there are so many of us. So one of the jobs of a marketplace is to make that easier. And to understand the problem that Airbnb had to solve and has largely solved, think about Hilton Hotels, their current competitors, along with other hotel companies. Think about how hard it would be to get a room at a Hilton Hotel if you could only inquire about one room at a time, right? And that's sort of the situation that many Airbnb apartments have. Many Airbnb hosts just preside over one property. So supposing you called up Hilton Hotels and you said, I want to stay in San Francisco next Friday. Have you got a room? And the receptionist would say to you, well, which room would you like? And you'd say, well, how about room 528? She'd say, I'm so sorry, room 528 is full next Friday. And then she'd hang up, and you'd have to call again and say, so how about room 527? And you might have to go through several phone calls before you could get a room if one was available. That's a little bit the Airbnb story. And when they started their website, their initial market design was that if I wanted to rent a room in my house and you wanted to book it, you would indicate on the web that you wanted to book the room, and maybe when I came home at the end of the day, I would find that 6 people wanted to book my room, and I could only give it to one of them. So I would give it to you maybe because you were the first to apply for it, but then I would have to tell 5 people, sorry, room 528 is unavailable, and they would have to try to find another room. So to deal with that wasn't a big problem when there weren't that many rooms and that many travelers, but as Airbnb succeeded in making a thick market, that became a much bigger problem. And today, what Airbnb does is if you try to book my room, then even before I have noticed you and confirmed that you can have the room, they stop showing my room to everyone else. So when I finally say yes to you, I don't have to say no to 5 other people, and that makes other people's search more efficient. And indeed, they've started to introduce buy it now kind of mechanisms where I can say, I'm willing to give this room to anyone with an Airbnb reputation above a certain level so that I don't even have to approve them anymore. So they're trying to deal with congestion. And we don't see any markets that have failed to deal with congestion, right? If you can't solve the congestion problem, you don't succeed as a marketplace. So another thing they've done is instead of having me book my room, make my room available in the morning on my laptop, and then when I come home from work, see if anyone has wanted it, they strongly encourage their hosts to use their smartphone apps so that they can check on the room during the day. And of course, they encourage them to do this buy it now kind of feature. So they're trying to speed up the whole process, as they must. If they hadn't succeeded in that, they would be like Hilton Hotels, only telling you one room at a time. Now, another thing they have to do is make the market safe and trustworthy and reliable so that when you book a room, you're pretty confident that the room will look like the one that I showed in the picture when I advertised the room, and that the key will be where it's supposed to be, and that the neighborhood will be safe if I say it's safe, and things like that. So they have to deal with issues of safety of various sorts. So I think these 3 things, helping make a market thick, dealing with congestion once you've succeeded in making it thick, and making the market safe and trustworthy and reliable to transact in are going to be the general things that all marketplaces have to do. And as I tell you about particular markets, keep those in mind, and I'll try to indicate where those were issues. So I've helped design a number of matching markets. I'll only talk to you about some of them today. The first ones on this list are labor markets, and those are markets in which wages, prices are very important, but they don't determine who gets what. So medical residencies, there was just a recent match day for doctors in which I'm sure Duke doctors did very well. Wages are important, but they're not the critical thing. In general, in labor markets, when you go out and get a job, the first thing your colleagues ask you isn't, what's your salary? They say, where are you working? Right? The match itself is important, not just the price. So a number of labor markets. But the markets I'm going to talk to you about today, among the ones that I've been involved in, are school choice systems, where we don't let money play a role in deciding which families get places in the top kindergartens in a city school system, and kidney exchange. I'll also talk to you about some other markets. So let me start talking about school choice. And this is work that, I was pretty sure I had this on my slides, but well, this is work I'm doing jointly with Tilado Kodoroglu, who's here, and Neil DeRosen and Parag Patak, who's at MIT. So it's joint work. And school choice is a case where we don't let prices decide who gets which public school places, but making the market thick isn't a problem because schooling is mandatory in the United States, so we keep up the demand by insisting that children go to school. But congestion and safety can be big problems. So let me tell you about those. But the idea of school choice, of course, is that, and what makes it a marketplace, is that parents have some information about which schools would be good for their children, and we'd like to be able to incorporate that information in school assignments, right? Since even in cities where there are not enough great schools for all the students, it's what's really a shame is that if your child is going to a school that would have been great for my kid, while my kid is going to a school that would have been great for your kid, and that could be avoided. And so let me tell you about some of the schools. I'm going to mostly talk about New York City and Boston schools, where I was deeply involved. Attila and Neil and Parag have carried that work forward into a variety of other schools around the country. So this is a technology that's spreading as school districts come to understand what makes school choice work well and what makes it work badly. So let me tell you a little about that, because many market design stories begin with market failures, right? So the opportunities for market design are markets that aren't working well. So in New York City, they had an old system. Well, first of all, it's the biggest school district in the United States. There are about 1.2 million children in New York schools. And at the time, now slightly fewer, but at the time that we started working with them, about 90,000 students entered high school each year in New York. And the way the process worked was families were invited to submit a list of preferences, first choice, second choice, third choice, to the school district, which copied those lists and sent them to the named high schools, and that constituted your application to the high school. And then the high schools made independent decisions. This is back in 2000, say. The high schools made independent decisions, which they communicated to the city, to the Department of Education. And the city then sent letters to the students informing them of what high schools they'd been admitted to. And of this large number of, because the high schools made independent decisions, about 17,000 students were admitted to multiple high schools. So they would get letters that said, congratulations, you've been admitted to these multiple high schools. Please send us a letter back telling us which of the high schools you've been admitted to you would like to attend, and if there's some other high school that you applied to that you would like to be on the waiting list for. So that took a little time, and in the meantime, there were many students who hadn't yet gotten admitted to a high school because so many students had multiple admissions. So they had time to do 3 letters. When students sent back their decision, that freed up new places in high schools that could make new admissions, and so a new round of letters could go out telling students where they had been admitted and what choices they wanted to make. But they only had time for 3 letters, And at the end of August, there were typically 30,000 students who hadn't yet been assigned to schools, who had to now be administratively assigned to schools for which they hadn't expressed any preference, just because time had run out, and come September, you have to be in high school if you're 14 years old. So that was the problem, that they had, a big congestion problem. But there were other problems as well. Remember, the way you applied to high school was you submitted this rank order list, which got copied and sent to the high schools. So if I was a high school principal, I could see that you were applying to my school as your third choice. And so I could adopt a strategy that would say, you know, I'm a popular school, I get lots of applications, I'm only going to admit kids who have applied to me as their first choice. And indeed, a lot of high schools adopted rules something like that. And of course, that had the effect of meaning that even though you were invited to write down 5 choices on your rank order list, you didn't really have 5 choices, because maybe your first and second choice both would only admit you if you listed them as your first choice, and therefore you had to decide which of them to list as your first choice. So rather than being an exercise in which it was safe to tell New York City schools what was your first choice, what was your second, what was your third, you instead had to engage in a strategic calculation. What's the best school I can get if I say it is my first choice? Okay, and that's a very different exercise than trying to figure out which schools you'd like to go to. Okay, so that was one of the things that we wanted to change, and indeed, it was understood that this was a strategic process. But another issue was that principals sometimes concealed capacities, right? There were going to be 30,000 children assigned administratively. That means basically at random to high schools. So if you were a high school principal, you had sometimes the ability to say, you know, the classrooms, 3 of the classrooms on the first floor are being renovated, and they are not going to be ready in September to admit a class. So we have fewer admissions available than we would have hoped. And then you could discover in September that the classrooms were now fully renovated, and you could admit 3 additional classrooms of children. And because there were so many unhappily assigned people, that meant that you might find students who you wanted to admit to your high school who you would prefer to the ones that you would have been assigned to you had you revealed these places initially. So there was an over-the-counter market that happened late, where people with appropriate connections were able to show up on the doorstep of schools and get their children into schools that they wouldn't have been able to get in the centralized procedure. Something similar happened in Boston without the congestion problem. So in Boston, they already had a centralized matching procedure. So they had no trouble getting all the school assignments done before school would start. But they had also had a problem with safety, that it wasn't safe for families to tell the Boston Public Schools, the school district, what their preferences were. And in Boston, I'm going to talk to you about a system that works not just for the high schools, but for all the schools. So you can think of yourself as being a family that gets to participate in this market because you have a child who just became kindergarten age. And so now it's time to get your kid into a school. And the way the old Boston system worked, which was studied by Attila and his colleague Typhoon Sunmez, it was very benign in intent. What they tried to do was they asked you to rank the schools you would like to be in, and then they tried to give as many people as possible their first choice. And so the way that worked was they'd look at all the first choices for each school, and if they could honor them all, if there were fewer people who chose a school than its capacity, then they just give those people their first choice. But in many cases with popular schools, they would find that the school was over-demanded, that more people listed it as first choice than they had capacity. And so for that, they had tie-breaking procedures. They assigned priorities to each student for each school. So for example, if a family had an older child who was already attending that school, that gave very high priority for a kindergarten student to attend so that the family would have only one morning drop-off. There were some priority for living close to the school, and then they assigned people random numbers to break ties. And so the way their algorithm worked was an immediate acceptance algorithm. They would order all the people who had applied to some school in priority order, and when they reached the capacity limit, they would accept all the people who were at highest priority up to the capacity limit and then reject the rest. And the difficulty with the system, what made it unsafe to to share your information about which schools would be good for your kid was that if you didn't get your first choice, there was an excellent chance that your second choice would have already filled all its seats with people who had listed it as their first choice. So even if you had very high priority for your second choice, even if you had an older child who already went to that school, so that you would have high enough priority to get in if you listed it as your first choice, you ran the risk that if you listed it as your second choice, you'd have lost your priority. You wouldn't get into your first choice, and your second choice would have filled all its seats. So in Boston, as in New York, you couldn't just, it wasn't safe to tell the city what your preferences were. You had to figure out which school you could get if you listed it as your first choice. So, what could be wrong with a system like this? This was the focus of the paper by Attila and Typhoon. It wasn't safe for families to list their true preferences. So the way we addressed this problem in both these problems, the congestion problem and the safety problem, in both New York and in Boston, was with a deferred acceptance algorithm. And the deferred acceptance algorithm turns out to have an older history than its study in economics does. It was first studied by David Gale and Lloyd Shapley. Lloyd just passed away in the last 2 weeks, and David had passed away sometime before. And they wrote a 1962 paper where they proposed an algorithm that it turns out solves both the congestion and the safety problem. And so let me tell you how students are now assigned in New York and Boston in a very skeletal way. And it turns out this is related to the way that medical students are assigned in the medical match. Okay, so here's how the algorithm works. First, the preferences are submitted privately now. This was one of the things we changed in New York. The schools no longer see the preference list. So as a school principal, I know that you've applied to me, but I no longer know whether I'm your first choice or your third choice. So I can no longer make admissions decisions of the form, I will only accept you if you listed me as your first choice. I no longer get that information. We don't show the preference list to the schools. And then what the algorithm does is it goes through the following steps. It first has each student apply to his or her first choice. And each school tentatively assigns its seats to applicants one at a time in their priority order. But it doesn't accept them now. It's going to defer acceptance until it gets to see just what other applications might come in the future. That's why it's called a deferred acceptance algorithm. But it immediately rejects any applicants who can't be fit in. So a kindergarten that has 20 places and gets 40 applicants will order them in priority order, reject numbers 21 through 40, and not yet reject any of the ones in the top 20, but reserve the right to reject them later. And then every student who is rejected applies to his or her second choice. And the schools now look at all the people who have applied now together with the ones who had applied before. It orders them in its preference or priority ordering. And again, it doesn't reject the top 20, and it rejects the rest, who may include some people who weren't rejected in the earlier stage, but are now rejected as people with high priority apply. So that's key here. It's that if you apply as your second choice to a school where you have high priority, you'll go right to the top of their list. You don't lose your priority of having a child who already goes to that school. And then at each step of the algorithm, anyone who was rejected in the previous step applies to their next choice school. The schools look at everyone who's applied, order them in terms of their original preferences and priorities, so they don't care, they don't notice at what point in the algorithm your application comes in. They hold on to the ones they can fit, they reject the rest, and the algorithm, the applications are only accepted when there are no more applications. And at that point, each school accepts the applicants, the class that it's holding, and that's the deferred acceptance algorithm. That's the matching that gets published. So there are a couple of things you can say to principals and to families about this. The first thing you can say is you can say to principals, there aren't going to be students who you would rather have been assigned than the ones that you were assigned through the match. There aren't students who you would rather have been assigned and who would rather go to your school than to where they've been assigned. How do you know that? Well, if I'm assigned to my third choice school and you were my second choice school, you're the principal at my second choice school, the reason I'm assigned to my third choice school is I first applied to my first choice and was rejected. Then I applied to my second choice, that's you, and was rejected when you filled your places with students you like better than me. So if I'm at my third choice school, it's because you didn't want me. And if you want me more than the students you have, it must mean that I'm at a school that I like better than you. If you want me more than students you currently have, it means I never applied to you. Otherwise, I would have risen to the top of your list because you like me better than some of the students you took. So there aren't any pairs of schools and students who aren't matched to each other who would both prefer to be matched to each other. And the thing you can say to families is that it's perfectly safe to put down your preferences in their true order. And loosely speaking, the reason is because if you don't get your first choice, your chance of getting your second choice is just as high as if you had said it was your first choice. You don't lose your priority by saying a school is your second choice, because when you apply to them after being rejected by your first choice, they put you in the same place in their order that they would have put you whenever you applied. So that turns out to make it safe, completely safe, to tell the city what schools you really like. And so a couple of things happened. One, having to do with congestion, is this is a computerized algorithm, so it works fast. They don't have to wait for the mails to come back and forth with acceptances and rejections. Because you've given us a rank order list of the high schools you've applied to, we know if you get offers from both your second and your fifth, we know which one you want. You want your second choice, not your fifth choice. So that's done at computer speed rather than individual decision-making speed. We've asked you to make the decisions before making the assignments. So only 3,000 students instead of 30,000 students didn't receive assignments to schools they'd expressed preferences over and had to be assigned administratively. And that's a number that it turns out in a school system the size of New York. It's hard to get too much smaller than that number. My understanding is that a significant portion of those students fail to submit a rank order list, right? It's hard to communicate with everyone in such a big school system. So that was a big success. The many fewer students are unassigned. But a more surprising thing happened in the first years of the New York City match, which is, although the algorithm didn't change at all, the results got better and better. So here's, in the first year of the new algorithm, here's how many people got their first choice and second choice and third choice and fourth choice. Now you look at the second year and you see more people got their first choice, more people got their first or second choice, more people got their first, second, or third choice. Right? People are just doing better in the second year. And you look at the third year and still more people got their first choice, more got their first or second choice, more got their first, second, or third. So these distributions stochastically dominate each other is the phrase for that kind of relationship. Question is, what's going on? How come more students are getting their choices? And I think the answer is that, remember those places that principals were withholding, because if they withheld some places, they could do deals with students that would get them better students than they would get through the centralized match. Well, that isn't true anymore for the reason that I argued. And so as principals started to learn that, more places started to come back into the system. That is, you'd notice that the renovation on your first floor classrooms was already done. And you could just admit the students through the centralized procedure because waiting for them to show up on your doorstep was no longer having the good effect that it once did. And because you weren't getting assigned random students anymore, you were getting assigned the students you asked for. So that was an unanticipated benefit about making the market safe on both sides. So let me switch from school choice to other markets. And let me start by talking about wheat, because wheat is the prototypical commodity market. But commodity markets need design. Okay, let's think about how commodity markets are designed. Wheat started off as a matching market because fields of wheat are heterogeneous. They're not all the same. So in the 1800s, if you wanted to buy wheat, you had to inspect it, because every field of wheat is different. And that also meant that you didn't just look at samples. You might want to develop relationships with particular farmers who grew the kind of wheat you wanted to buy. So what I say in the book is that God made wheat, but the Chicago Board of Trade made number 2 hard red winter wheat, which is what we make bread out of. And that involves designing the commodities so that you don't have to look at them before you buy them. So, now there are 8 classes of wheat, durum, hard red, spring, hard red, winter, soft red, winter, hard white, So you can buy wheat like a financial commodity. You don't have to inspect it. You can buy it before it's planted. You don't have to know who you're buying it from. You don't have to sample all the offers. It's a financial market. And that changes, of course, what wheat is available. But often when we speak of commodifying things, we act as if that automatically lowers the quality, which it might do. You know, you can have a certain percentage of soft wheat in your hard wheat and still be called hard wheat. So that might damage, but it often improves the quality. There's a new commodity market in Ethiopia called the Ethiopia Commodity Exchange, which is basically a market for coffee. And it used to be that if you wanted to buy coffee from Ethiopia, which is a big producer, you had to send a man to Addis to taste the coffee because you had to sample it. Every, coffee beans are different. But now they've got a commodity exchange where they've successfully made a market design that allows them to reliably grade coffee. It has to do with double-blind grading so that the people tasting the coffee don't know whose coffee it is, so they can't be bribed to say it's high quality. And that has made it possible to buy coffee in bulk at a distance by, you can order grade A coffee from Ethiopia and buy a lot of it without examining it. Turns out that's also increased the supply of grade A coffee. And the story about coffee, as I understand it, is when you sell coffee, you're selling the beans, and the beans are always brown. But when you're harvesting them, they're in a cherry, and it's ripe when the cherry is red. When the cherry is green, you shouldn't harvest them yet, but it's hard to tell by inspection when it was harvested. So when there wasn't good quality control, when you weren't getting rewarded for producing high-quality coffee, the economical thing to do was go to some hillside and tell your pickers to harvest all the bushes, even though while they were mostly red cherries, some of them were green. But now that you're getting rewarded for producing grade A coffee, it makes sense to tell your pickers only pick the red cherries, and we'll come back later and pick the ones that are now green. So having a reliable grading system and a commodity market actually increased the amount of high-quality coffee coming out of Ethiopia. Now, commodity markets used to operate, here's a picture of the Chicago Board of Trade, and you're just supposed to see that it's a hectic mess. They operated in trading pits where people would signal to each other, I want to buy 5 at a price of 2, and the first person to shout that they took my offer would get it, and that's how commodity markets looked in the early days. Here's the trading pits. Well, we don't do that anymore. Most trading these days is done through computers, and some of it is done by computers. But we still use the old rules, and they may have become somewhat dysfunctional. So one of the questions that we're always facing is, how does technology change market designs? And it's easy to see that with new markets. It's easy to understand why eBay didn't exist before the internet, because you can now do garage sales on a national basis. But at the same time, why Uber couldn't exist just with the internet, why it needed smartphones that know where you are so you can call a taxi wherever you are. You don't have to be at your computer in your office. Let's think a little bit about commodity markets like financial commodities and how they're traded. And now I'm going to tell you about work by Eric Budish, who's a former student of mine who now teaches at the University of Chicago, and his colleagues Crampton and Shim. And what they've been looking at, as have a lot of other people, there's a movie on the subject now, is about high-speed trading and how that has changed the way we trade financial commodities. And it's changed the nature of competition in those markets. So the example that I want to use is trading of very similar financial commodities on the New York Stock Exchange and the Chicago Mercantile Exchange. And the commodities that I'll use as my example are Standard & Poor's 500 index bundles. You can trade them in different ways, exchange-traded funds and futures, but of course they're the same economic bundle, so their prices move together in both markets. And the rules are the same rules that used to be in commodity trading pits. The first person to take a bid or an ask gets the trade. And what you like is if competition on bids and asks should be price competition. I should try to make my bids and asks close together so I can get trades on both sides of the market. But instead, what we're starting to see is competition also on speed. And so the way you communicate prices between New York and Chicago is along electronic communication lines of various sorts. And the first ones went along the roads. And it's 790 miles by road between New York and Chicago, and so the speed of light gives you some transaction time for getting information back and forth. But it's pretty fast because it used to be about 16 milliseconds. But in 2010, someone invested in a a straighter line, so it was shorter. So instead of 16 milliseconds, it went down to 13 milliseconds. And that turned out to give a big advantage to the people who got their information on that line because they could take trades earlier than other people. And it had a bad effect on competition because if I'm a liquidity provider, I try to provide bids and asks that are close together. But if you're faster than I am and you get news about a price change in one market that is going to be echoed in the other market faster than I do, then you can take my stale quotes and act on one of them before I can change it. So I have to spread them further apart to protect myself against getting sniped like that. So just to put this in context, it takes up to 400 milliseconds for you to blink your eyes. So when we're talking about a 3 millisecond difference, we're not talking about a difference that makes the kind of difference that you could ponder economic news, right? This is really fast stuff. So, and the demand comes because of this first come, first serve. The first person to take a quote gets it. So here are the prices of these two Standard & Poor's 500 bundles on the two exchanges, hour by hour at some particular day. And what you see is they move really closely together. That doesn't mean they don't change during the day, but they move really closely together. They're the same thing, one in New York and one in Chicago. And what you see is a little before 2 o'clock, there's a relatively big price jump. But they jump together when you're looking at it. These data are minute by minute. Okay? Now let's look at it millisecond by millisecond. The same day, the same jump. And what you see is here's 151.39.55, and before 151.39.600, the big jump takes place, and it happens in one market before the other. That's why the high-speed trading is valuable. Someone can see the market move and trade on the stale prices in Chicago or in New York before they get there, and maybe even buy from me and then sell back to me when I update my stale prices. Right? So they're in and out quick, taking advantage of that few millisecond difference between their information and mine. Now, if you look at the duration for those differences between New York and Chicago, you see the duration gets shorter and shorter as trading gets faster and faster. How long those arbitrage opportunities remain gets less and less time, but how profitable they are stays constant. So if you can jump on them faster, you can make quite a lot of money on many, many of these transactions over the course of a day, but you have to jump on them faster and faster because they're not lasting very long. So that's something that is using the old rules of transactions, of the marketplace, first come, first serve, in a world where more and more of the trading is not done by human beings, but is done by computers, where that competition by speed may be inhibiting competition by price. Not to mention the fact that billions of dollars a year are spent to no social purpose on building faster and faster high-speed lines. The fastest ones now are at 8.5 milliseconds. The 13 millisecond lines are now obsolete. You can't use them to trade on. So, so this can have bad effects of a number of sorts. And one proposal that Eric and his colleagues have made is they say, supposing we ran financial exchanges not first come, first serve continuous time. Supposing we just ran them every second. Okay? So a second is a short time for processing economic news, but it's long enough that lots of transactions get offered for Standard & Poor's 500 bundles. So you could run them every second, and a second is slow enough that everyone can keep up. Everyone can process a second. So that would be a different kind of market. It would need some regulatory changes to allow it to compete with other markets because there are rules now that require markets to constantly post prices. But that and other changes are the kind of market design changes we should expect to see as technology and old rules interact. So rules are part of the technology, and we have to keep them up to date. So I think this is a pretty standard story. That is, markets are living things. They are, people will develop new strategies, partly through new technology, partly through other methods that market design will have to keep up with. One of the examples I sort of give, so market design is a part of economic engineering, and the economics responds to all sorts of things. One of the examples I give is bridges. The basic physics, the reason bridges stand up hasn't changed since the Romans built their bridge. But we build bridges differently today, and even bridges on the same design get longer and stronger and lighter over time. And partly that's because of technological change. It's also because bridges themselves change people's behavior. When you build a bridge over a river, you get more traffic over that river, and then you need bigger roads on both sides. And after you've got bigger roads, you're going to get still more traffic, and eventually you'll need bigger bridges. So markets also change people's behavior, and market design, like bridge design, has to adapt over time in ways that fundamental physical principles don't have to adapt over time. That's one of the differences between engineering and science. So in that spirit, let me tell you about kidney exchange, which is one of the markets I've been involved in that doesn't allow prices to play a role at all. And the story about kidney exchange is there's a lot of kidney disease in the world, and the treatment of choice, here at the dawn of the 21st century, is still transplantation. Okay, that's something that's only been possible since the 1950s, so it's a new thing. Eventually it'll be an old thing and we won't have to do it anymore. But by the time we don't need to do transplantation, everyone who now needs a kidney will be dead. So we have to think about how to take care of the people who are ill now with the technology we have now. And this morning, more than 100,000 people were waiting for a deceased donor kidney in the United States. And we only do about 11,000 deceased donor transplants a year in the United States. So the wait is long and costly and dangerous, and people can die while waiting. Here, probably the way you get on the deceased donor registration list is the way we get on it in California. We encounter it when we get our driver's licenses. And there's a question on the Department of Motor Vehicles form that asks if you'd like to be registered on the organ donor registry. And about half of American adults are registered, but only about 1% of deaths result in donatable organs. It turns out dying is bad for your organs. But so you have to die on a ventilator. You have to die of brain death on a ventilator. So there's a shortage of organs. But there's another way you can get kidney transplants, because each of you has 2 kidneys. And if you're as healthy as I hope you are, you can remain healthy with just 1 kidney. And that means that if someone you loved had kidney failure and was at threat of losing their life, you could save their life by donating a kidney to them. You have to be healthy enough. You'd have to go through a lot of tests. But even if you're healthy enough, it might turn out that you can give a kidney to someone, but you can't give it to the person you love, because kidneys have to be well matched. And that's what opens up the door to economists. Sometimes you can't give a kidney to the person you love, and I can't give a kidney to the person I love, but I could give a kidney to your patient, you can give a kidney to my patient. So that opens up the door to exchange. And the simplest kind of exchange is between 2 pairs, 2 incompatible patient-donor pairs. So in this picture, donor 1 loves recipient 1, but they have incompatible blood types. That's a barrier to transplantation. Donor 2 loves recipient 2. They have the opposite barrier. So you can see that if we can get these 2 pairs together, it's possible to get 2 transplants, where otherwise we wouldn't have any, because the type B kidney can go to the type B patient and the type A kidney can go to the type A patient. So that's an exchange. Notice that it's an in-kind exchange. No money changes hands. One reason no money changes hands is it's a felony in the United States to pay for a kidney for transplantation. Here's a sentence from the National Organ Transplant Act, which says it's unlawful for any person to acquire, transfer any human organ for valuable consideration for transplantation. So valuable consideration turns out to be a somewhat tightly packed legal phrase. You might look at this picture and say to yourself, that sure looks like valuable consideration for me. A valuable kidney is being exchanged for another valuable kidney. We started doing these things in the U.S. in early 2000. The Justice Department declined to write a memo saying, of course, it's legal. Justice Department is not wild about writing memos. Eventually, Congress amended the law. They looked at this sentence and wrote an amendment that said the preceding sentence does not apply with respect to human organ paired donation. Paired donation is a polite phrase for kidney exchange that doesn't include the word exchange, and consequently makes it even clearer that no valuable consideration has been given. And basically the Congress decided, this was passed by acclaim after 3 tries. It was the 3rd Congress in which it was introduced. The sponsor in the House was Charlie Norwood, who passed away due to an immunological post-transplant disease, and his colleagues at that point named the act after him and passed it unanimously. So the repugnance to selling kidneys doesn't transfer to kidney exchange. At least in the United States, we think of kidney exchange as a transaction that people can do, even though selling kidneys is something we don't like. I just spoke about this in Germany. The German law doesn't allow kidney exchange because the German transplant law, in order to make really sure that you haven't bought my kidney, says you can't have my kidney under any circumstances. You can only receive a kidney in Germany from a member of what they call your first order family, your parents, your siblings, your spouse, or your children. So, and I think the idea is that if I showed up wanting to give you a kidney in Germany, they would presume that you had bought it from me. So one of the things that my German colleagues and I are trying to do is try to change the law to allow exchange, because if I want to give a kidney to my brother and you want to give a kidney to your brother, they're already sure that no money has changed hands. They're confident of that because it's my brother. And now we turn out to be incompatible, so we want to engage in exchange. They shouldn't feel that there's more of a burden to prove no commercial thing. But we'll see. The German prosecutors don't have a sense of humor, so we'll see what happens. So there's a lot of congestion in organizing kidney exchanges. I'm the man in the yellow gown keeping my hands to myself. There's a kidney in this bucket. It comes from an operating room right behind me in this picture, not here. You can't see it, but steps away, the nephrectomy, the kidney removal has just been performed. And here, the transplant's going in. This is happening in 2006 so before the Norwood Act was passed. It's happening in 2006 in Cincinnati, Ohio. And at the same time, in Toledo, Ohio, Mike Reese and his surgical colleagues are doing the same thing with the patient who belongs to this donor and the donor who belongs to this patient. That is, the donors traveled from Cincinnati to Toledo and from Toledo to Cincinnati. And when I say at the same time, the guy in the red cap is named Steve Whittle. After the surgeons had anesthetized the patients and made the initial incisions, he got on his cell phone from the operating room and called up Mike in Toledo and said, "We're ready here. Are you ready?" And only when he heard that they were ready did both sets of operations go ahead. And that's because you can't give valuable consideration for a kidney. And that means you can't write a contract that says, we'll give you a kidney today and you give us a kidney tomorrow. So to make sure that the links all work, they do it simultaneously. But what that means is the market is congested. To do even a simple exchange, you have to be able to assemble 4 operating rooms and 4 surgical teams at the same time. To do a 3-way exchange simultaneously, you'd need 6 operating rooms and 6 surgical teams because you have to do the nephrectomies and the transplants all at the same time. So, and the nephrectomy immediately precedes the transplant. That's one of the good things about living donor kidneys. So it's hard to do big exchanges. Turns out you can sometimes do big exchanges if you start with a non-directed donor. So we have a couple of hundred non-directed donors in the U.S. each year. They want to give a kidney to someone, but they don't have a particular patient in mind. So you can arrange a chain in which each patient-donor pair gets a kidney before they give one. That means you don't run the risk that if the link is broken, that some pair will have already given a kidney but not gotten one, which means not only have they had a surgery that didn't benefit them, but they no longer have a kidney to exchange, so they can't participate in next week's kidney exchange. But if you can make sure that everyone gets a kidney before they give one, a broken link doesn't have that property. So instead of having only 6 people in the picture, which is what we could do with 6 operating rooms assembled at the same time, we can now get longer chains. Here's the very first one, organized by Mike Reese in Toledo. It had 20 people in the picture, 10 transplants and 10 nephrectomies. It was eventually extended to a longer chain. Another 12 transplants came out of it. And sometimes we have very long chains. The average length of a chain in the United States is 5 transplants now, so that there are some short ones and there are some long ones. And bridge donors are the donors who are asked to wait. You know, your sister gets a kidney today and we ask you to give a kidney next Tuesday. We only have about a 2% renege rate. So people are much nicer and more complex than economists sometimes give us credit for. Kidney exchange is growing in the United States. It's growing elsewhere in the world as well. I have a blog called Market Design, and one of the things I follow is kidney exchange. And the most recent entry of this sort was this month. In 2016, the first paired kidney exchange in Singapore. So kidney exchange is spreading slowly around the world. But there are places in the world where there's very little care for kidney patients. This is a chart that shows deceased donation per million population and living donation per million population. So the US, we do pretty well on both. Germany is here. They do pretty well on deceased donation, but of course they don't do so well on living donation because their law really restricts who you can get a kidney from, and in particular they don't have kidney exchange. But there are places like the Philippines and Nigeria where there's virtually no transplantation, and the Philippines is an important place because they actually have good hospitals there. You could get a transplant competently done, ably done, and you could get post-surgical care in the Philippines. The reason they have so little transplantation is Philippine health insurance doesn't cover it. So it's outside the financial reach of most people. So Mike Reese initiated a project that Tim and I have been talking with him about for a number of years now on trying to incorporate some of these Philippine patients into American kidney exchange with the idea that every time you transplant an American, it saves the American healthcare system a good deal of money, say $250,000 in the first 5 years. That's sufficient to pay for the transplant and post-surgical care forever of the Philippine pair. So there's a possibility of some kind of mutual aid where you'd incorporate these guys into exchange. Here's the American pair, here's the Philippine pair. Neither of them can get the transplants on their own, but there's a financial barrier for the Philippine pair, an incompatibility barrier for the American pair. They can help each other out with the American health system paying for the cost from the savings to the American system. So the first Philippine pair is now a year old. They participated in what's become a pretty long chain and are, because of this self-financing aspect, they're now back, they've been a year now healthily back in the Philippines with an escrow account that pays for the lifelong immunosuppressive drugs and things like that they're going to need. So this is something where the engineering, the design is going to have to come in financial flows. The savings come at some places like Medicare and private insurance, and the new costs come at transplant centers for surgeries and later on for drugs delivered overseas. This is still a work in progress. I'm not sure how quickly we'll make progress, but Tim and Mike have a paper on the legal aspects of this, and there are various other papers in the mix, which have been rejected by very fine journals. So let me close by saying that matching markets are important. They're some of the most important markets that we deal in. Where you go to school, what job you get, who you marry, whether you get a kidney. These are important things. They're not commodity markets. They're not markets where you can just choose what you want. You also have to be chosen. When you look around and say what other matching markets are failing, one of the ones that comes naturally to mind is refugee and migrant resettlement. Okay, we're seeing a lot of problems of that sort in Europe. Refugees are just the people who you can't tell them where to go. They were someplace they didn't want to be and they left. They're people who can move. Of course, here in the United States, once you come to the United States, we can try to resettle you someplace, but you're free to go wherever you like. So for instance, there's a Somali community in Lewiston, Maine. It's not because the Somalis all really like cross-country skiing. It's because there was a Somali community in Lewiston, Maine, and if we try to settle you in Wisconsin now, you might like to go to Lewiston. There are good economic reasons for you to want to do that. For instance, I live in California, and if you come to California, if you migrate to California and you happen to speak only Mandarin or only Spanish, you can still find work in California while you're learning English. You'll surely have to learn English, but you can find someone who will employ you and give you instructions in your language and talk to the customer in English while you're getting used to living in California. Whereas if you were resettled in Wisconsin, the best we might be able to do is get you translated government forms of how to apply for assistance in Mandarin, but you're working in California. So as we think about refugees in the current crises, which are full-blown now and therefore not ideal places for orderly redesign of refugee and migrant resettlement. We should learn what we can from the future. We'll have many opportunities to learn what doesn't work well and maybe some things that work well, because there will be refugees after the Syrian civil war. And in particular, if the sea level rises, there will be lots of refugees in the next century. So we had better learn how to handle mass migration of people, which is a matching market. And I'll stop there because I'd like to leave some time for questions.
Okay, we've got time for just a couple of questions. So, and Joseph will make his way back to you with a microphone that we think is not just ornamental, but we'll discover. Questions? I know. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Roth. Can you comment on the effect of this improvement on illegal exchange of kidneys, on black market exchange of kidneys?
Okay, so, repugnant transactions and the way Kim and I talk about them are transactions that some people would like to engage in and other people don't think they should. And what that means is often when you make a market illegal, you see plenty of black markets. There are black markets for kidneys. I visited one in Azerbaijan, in Baku. I don't see global kidney exchange as having immediately significant effects on those markets because the people who want to buy kidneys are mostly people who don't have a willing living donor, and the people who want to sell them are mostly people who don't have someone they wanted to give a kidney to. So I see this as intersecting more like kidney exchange. There's, as you know, a long discussion about whether we should be changing the incentives for donors to get more donors. And right now in the United States, if you wanted to give me a kidney, it would cost you money out of pocket. You'd have to fly to California where I live, and you'd have to get a hotel room, and you'd have to take time off from work. You could pay several $1,000s easily just giving me a kidney. And we don't, for instance, make it easy for you to be repaid for that. So I think there's growing consensus that we should do better on that. And there's some sentiment that maybe we should start allowing someone, maybe the federal government, to pay for kidneys. And the question, the surgical community is divided on the effect that would have on black markets. There are people who say don't pay for kidneys, who think that there's already some difficulty in getting the authorities to discourage black markets in far places, and that if we made a legal American market, that would, even if it was an orderly one, that would cause unruly, terrible black markets to multiply overseas. And of course, there are people who think that having legal markets would shut off some of the oxygen for the black markets, much the way that buying nice wine today in a wine store is very different from buying bootleg whiskey during Prohibition, when you had to buy from criminals. So I don't know, but black markets are hard to stamp out, right? I mean, think about not just kidneys, which we like kidney transplants. Think about the markets for narcotics. Think about Prohibition. I think the story with Prohibition is we repealed Prohibition and accepted a somewhat higher alcoholism rate for a greatly lower crime rate associated with alcohol. So I think that many of these questions are empirical. Think about the market for narcotics. No one thinks that anyone should take heroin, but if you told me that legalizing heroin would cause a small increase in addiction and a great decrease in crime, I'd probably be in favor of it. If you told me that it would cause a great increase in addiction and only a small decrease in crime, then I'd probably think it was a bad deal.
Could you comment on the kidney exchange market in Iran and how that compares to some of the models you propose?
So the one country in the world where there's an explicitly legal monetary market for kidneys is the Islamic Republic of Iran. And they don't do kidney exchange. You can purchase a kidney there. You couldn't purchase a kidney there. Their law says that you have to have the same citizenship as the person you purchased the kidney from. So it's mostly Iranian, but there's a small Afghan market as well. It's hard to get good data on how that market works. One thing, though, about repugnant transactions is making them legal doesn't always make them non-repugnant. So I don't know very much about that market. They've only recently begun to digitize their data, and the gentleman who was responsible for that just passed away. So we haven't gotten any digitized data from that market. One thing that worries me about that market is when you interview people who have sold their kidneys in Iran, they mostly wish to remain anonymous, right? So this is not something that they're proud of. When I was young, the Vietnam War was on, and we had a conscription army. And today we have a volunteer army. And one of the things we talked about was, would that turn American soldiers into mercenaries? And I think effectively, you can have other opinions about other effects, but effectively it didn't do that, right? Today, when someone runs for the Senate, if he was a Marine, it's his campaign that says he was a Marine. You should vote for me because when I was young, I was a Marine, and we were happy to line up behind them when we board airplanes. That's not the case, apparently, with kidney sellers in Iran. They wish to remain anonymous. So there's something wrong with that market, because I think if we were to have a successful market for kidneys in the United States, one of the ways you could tell it was successful was years later when people ran for the Senate. They would say, you should vote for me because when I was young, I did a good thing. I saved a life and donated a kidney. And of course I was paid. That's not an issue. When I was, when my colleague was a Marine, he was paid too. It's still service to the country. So one of the interesting things I've sort of discussed and heard discussed about trying to remove the disincentive for kidney donors in the U.S. would be to do something like saying, when you donate a kidney, you get something like an honorable discharge from the Army. You can now go to VA hospitals. You get, you served your country. I wouldn't mind when I board a plane lining up behind kidney donors too, but that's not the case in Iran. So I don't know enough about Iran, but that's a flag in the wind that something about that market isn't quite working the way it should. And there are lots of repugnant markets that are legal in some places, not in others. Again, I was just in Germany. Prostitution is legal in Germany, but my guess is no one runs for German political office and says, vote for me because when I was young I was a sex worker. It's still a repugnant market. So there's something wrong with markets where I'm not proud of having participated in them, or I think I should be concealed.
We're done. Thank you so much.
Thank you.